She opened doors for frozen drivers, not even knowing what to feed them. But 48 hours later, something happened that she didn't expect. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The wind moaned through the broken seal of the front door, threading its icy fingers through the old diner like it was searching for something long forgotten. The fluorescent lights above the counter buzzed, one flickering in a tired rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the woman wiping down the same spot for the third time in an hour. Daniela Matthews stood behind the cracked Formica counter of Mabel's diner, a dishcloth in her hand and a furrow carved deep between her brows. The place smelled faintly of old grease and something sweeter, something like memory. Outside, the road was quiet. The stretch of two-lane highway that once pulsed with the lifeblood of trucks and travelers had gone still years ago when the new interstate veered west, dragging business and hope away with it. Mabel's had once been a beacon for anyone passing through, a place where the coffee was always hot, the pie always fresh, and the owner, Mabel herself, had known every driver's name and story. But Mabel had passed on 5 winters ago, and now the diner belonged to Daniela, her granddaughter, who clung to it like a raft in stormy water. Her hands were dry and red from soap and winter air, her nails short and broken from work. A pale blue cardigan hung from her shoulders, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her eyes, dark and tired, watched the wind dance with the snow outside the wide front windows. The neon sign that still buzzed faintly, Mabel's Eats, flickered in protest against the cold, casting flashes of pink and orange across the tiled floor. In the booth, closest to the back, her son Josh sat hunched over a battered school workbook, pencil gripped tightly in his hand. At 10, he had his father's chin and his mother's stubbornness. His little sister, Mia, lay curled next to him with a blanket pulled up to her chin, her small fingers gripping a worn teddy bear. The heater at their feet coughed and sputtered, doing its best to pretend it still worked. There had been no customers that day. There hadn't been any the day before either. 2 trucks had passed by without stopping, just shadows in the snow. Daniela tried not to take it personally. She had bills stacked high on the shelf behind the counter. Electric, water, rent. She'd stopped opening most of them. What good was knowing the damage if she couldn't fix it? The radio on the shelf crackled with a storm warning. The voice was calm, clinical. Severe winter storm moving across western Oklahoma. Blizzard conditions expected. Residents advised to stay off the roads and shelter in place. Daniela clicked it off with a sigh. Shelter in place. As if she had anywhere else to go. She moved behind the counter and poured the last of the coffee into a chipped mug. She didn't drink it. She just held it, let the warmth seep into her fingers. Josh looked up. "Mom, should we close up?" She glanced at the clock, just after 5. "We'll give it another hour," she said gently. Josh didn't argue. He went back to his math problems, chewing the edge of his pencil. Daniela admired his patience, his quiet strength. He'd learned too early how to be older than his years. He helped her set tables, wash dishes, and look after Mia like it was second nature. She'd never asked it of him. He just stepped up when the world stepped down. The wind howled louder and the building groaned. Somewhere in the back, a pot banged against the wall. Daniela jumped, then chuckled quietly to herself. Old places made old sounds. She moved through the diner, checking windows, tightening the latch on the back door, and folding the last of the napkins. Mia stirred on the bench, eyes blinking open. "Is Daddy coming home today?" Daniela froze. "No, baby," she said softly, kneeling beside her. Daddy's still watching us from heaven, remember?" Mia nodded slowly, pressing her face into the teddy bear. Daniela kissed her forehead and stood up, swallowing the lump in her throat. She busied herself restocking the sugar containers, but there wasn't much to restock. Supplies were low. There were maybe 3 cans of soup left, a few slices of bread already going stale, and a box of crackers she'd hidden behind the counter in case the kids needed something to eat later. The old fridge buzzed, the shelves inside looking more like a museum than a pantry. She made a note in her head. If no one came in tonight, she'd have to decide between heating or groceries. Again. She moved to the front windows and looked out at the highway. It was empty, as always. Snow swirled like ghosts across the asphalt, the kind of snow that muffled sound and time. She could barely see the silhouette of the sign out front, its colors dim and blurred. "Mama?" Josh's voice again. She turned. He held something in his hands, a photograph. She crossed the room and took it gently. It was old, faded at the edges, the colors muted but the emotion alive. Mabel, standing behind the counter, arms open wide, flanked by 2 laughing truckers. Behind her, the diner had been full. Daniela had seen the photo dozens of times, but now it struck her like a punch. "She didn't close during the ice storm," Josh said quietly. "Remember? You told me. She stayed open so people wouldn't freeze." "I remember." He looked up at her, eyes so much like her own. "Are we going to close tonight?" Daniela looked around. The snow, the cold, the empty shelves. She looked at her children. "No," she said, "not tonight." She put the photo back on the shelf and took a deep breath. The air smelled of coffee and cold metal. The door creaked louder under the pressure of the wind. She crossed the floor and put her hand on the open-closed sign. It was set to open, but had been more a hope than a fact. She held it there, hesitating. Josh and Mia watched her from the booth. Her hand dropped back to her side. The sign stayed. Daniela returned to the counter, set her mug down, and began checking the old coffee machine. It spat angrily at her but gurgled to life. Another hour, she thought, just in case. She didn't know then how much could change in an hour, how one knock on the door could ripple through time like a stone thrown in still water. Outside, the snow piled higher, the wind picked up speed, and the night pressed closer around Mabel's diner. Inside, a mother, her children, and the last flicker of a legacy held their ground against the dark. The wind didn't let up. It howled harder, as though offended that its fury had yet to drive Daniela from the diner. Snow fell faster now, in fat, heavy flakes that stuck to the windows in icy patches. Outside, the world was turning white, erasing every landmark, every fence post, every stretch of asphalt that once meant movement and life. Inside Mabel's, the yellow light cast a small circle of resistance like a lantern in the dark, trembling but unyielding. Josh had finally closed his math book, pushing it to the side with a sigh of defeat. Mia had drifted off again, curled up tight against his side. Daniela, now settled behind the counter with the last mug of lukewarm coffee, sat with her eyes half closed, not quite asleep, not quite awake. Her fingers moved in slow circles around the rim of the cup, her mind swimming in numbers she didn't want to face. Bills, bank accounts, gallons of gas, the hours until sunrise. Then came the noise. It was soft at first, a low rumble, nearly lost in the howl of the wind. But it grew louder, closer, vibrating through the floor and into her bones. Daniela snapped upright. The kids stirred. Josh sat up straighter. "Mama, is that—" She was already moving toward the window. Through the blurred frost, headlights pierced the storm. 1, 2. A slow-moving shape emerged, lumbering like a beast from the snow. Then came the sound of brakes hissing, the groan of metal, and finally the crunch of heavy tires on the frozen gravel outside. A semi-truck. The engine cut off, and for a moment there was only silence again. Then the unmistakable sound of a door opening and boots hitting the ground. The figure moved quickly toward the door, head bowed against the wind, a heavy parka pulled tight around broad shoulders. The bell above the entrance jingled sharply as the door swung open, a blast of frigid air rushing inside like a warning. The man paused on the threshold, snow clinging to his coat and beard, eyes blinking against the sudden light. Daniela was already behind the counter again, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. He was tall, maybe in his 60s, white, his face weathered and windburned, the kind of man you saw in truck stops and old photos, part of the landscape of the road. "Evening," he said, his voice rough, hoarse from cold and diesel. "Hi," she replied cautiously. "We're still open. Sort of." He pulled back his hood and offered a small, grateful smile. "Didn't expect anyone to be. I've been driving through this mess for hours. Interstates shut down 20 miles back. Everything else was closed up tight. This was the only light I saw." "Come in, warm up," she said, stepping aside. "Coffee's not fresh, but it's hot." He made his way to the counter, boots leaving wet prints on the linoleum. "Hot'll do just fine." He sat heavily on a stool, pulled off his gloves, and flexed his fingers. "Name's Roy." "Daniela," she said, pouring what remained of the coffee into a clean cup. "That's Josh, and the little one's Mia." Roy nodded toward the kids. "You live here?" "Behind the diner, in the trailer." He sipped his coffee, wincing slightly at the bitterness, but saying nothing. "You're brave, staying out here during a storm like this." "Not brave," she said, "just stuck." Roy didn't press her. He looked around, taking in the quiet diner, the empty booths, the photos on the walls, and the hum of the ancient heater rattling in the corner. "She yours?" he asked, nodding at a framed photo of Mabel on the wall. "My grandmother." "Thought so. I stopped here a few times back in the day. Best peach pie between Amarillo and Kansas City. She ran a good place." Daniela allowed herself a small smile. "She did." They sat in silence for a few minutes. The storm raged against the windows. Mia stirred again, pulling her blanket tighter. Josh watched Roy with cautious curiosity. The bell jingled again. Daniela's head snapped toward the door. Another man entered, this one younger, maybe in his 40s, Latino, face red from the cold. Behind him, the shapes of two more figures moved through the swirling snow. She blinked in surprise as 3 more men pushed into the warmth, brushing snow from their shoulders and stomping their feet on the mat. "Storm's getting worse," said the second man. "Every exit's blocked. You got anything hot, ma'am?" "Soup," she said automatically. "And bread, that's about it." "We'll take it," another said, shivering. She glanced at Roy, who gave her a nod. "We'll make it work," she said. The men found booths, chairs, even sat on the floor near the heater. There were 7 of them in all by the time the door stopped opening. 7 tired, snow-drenched, hungry men with frost in their hair and weariness in their bones. She didn't ask questions. They didn't offer stories. Daniela moved to the kitchen and set a pot on the stove, scraping together what she had: canned vegetable soup, a few slices of bread, some margarine. She heated water for tea, weak but hot, and began placing bowls on the counter one by one. Josh got up and helped without being asked, grabbing spoons and napkins, delivering the plates to the tables. The sound of conversation filled the diner. Low, grateful voices. The kind of talk shared between strangers when warmth is more important than details. A man named Mark, stocky and bearded, fixed the front door latch that had been sticking all week. Another, whose name she never caught, found the old mop and cleaned the slush near the entrance. Someone tossed another log into the rusted stove in the back. The diner came to life. Daniela kept moving, her body sore but her mind sharper than it had been in weeks. Something inside her stirred, not just purpose, but memory. The way the diner used to feel when her grandmother was alive, when the air was full of stories and steam and music from the jukebox. The jukebox was broken now, but in her mind, she could almost hear it humming. Mia, now awake, sat on Roy's lap with a blanket over her shoulders. He showed her how to fold a napkin into a crane, his large hands surprisingly gentle. She giggled when he made it flap its paper wings. Josh leaned against the counter, his eyes on his mother. "You did good, Mama," he said quietly. She didn't answer, just reached out and squeezed his hand. Outside, the wind battered the windows like an angry tide, but inside, the diner held strong, a little bastion of heat and humanity. The kind of place where you could forget, if only for a moment, how cold the world could be. Daniela looked around the room. The faces were unfamiliar, but the feeling wasn't. She saw shoulders relax, eyes soften, people breathe a little easier. One man raised his mug in a quiet salute. "To Mabel," he said. "She knew how to shelter a storm." There was a murmur of agreement, and a few heads nodded. Daniela's throat tightened. "To Mabel," she echoed, lifting her own cup. Just like that, the storm outside lost some of its power. The diner, dimly lit and worn at the edges, became more than a building again. It became what it had always been meant to be, a refuge, a place of warmth when the road turned cold. She didn't know how long it would last. She didn't know what they would eat tomorrow, or how she'd pay the power bill, or if this night was just one final flicker before the flame went out. But she knew one thing for certain. She had kept the light on. And tonight, that was enough. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that filtered in without warmth, like a visitor who had overstayed their welcome. Outside, the snow had not relented. It simply shifted from violent flurries to a heavy, oppressive silence. It lay thick across the trucks in the lot and heaped in drifts against the windows. The highway beyond the diner was invisible now, swallowed by the storm, a world erased by white. Inside Mabel's, the air was thick with the smell of reheated soup, damp boots, and stale coffee. The booths were occupied, some by men still sleeping in their jackets, heads resting on folded arms or curled against their duffel bags. Others sat quietly, sipping from mugs, eyes distant, lost in thoughts of routes delayed and families waiting. The space hummed with the quiet sounds of survival, the clink of spoons and mugs, the hiss of the old coffee machine, the occasional chuckle when someone muttered a joke through chapped lips. Daniela stood in the kitchen doorway, shoulders aching, arms crossed over her chest. She watched her son carefully slice the remaining half loaf of bread into thin, almost transparent pieces. He moved with precision and seriousness, like a surgeon with a dull scalpel. The effort he put into each cut twisted something in her chest. Mia, her blanket wrapped like a shawl around her small frame, carried napkins from booth to booth, offering them with a shy smile and an almost regal grace. The soup was gone, every last drop. Daniela had stretched it with water, with canned corn, even with a splash of milk, but it was finished now. The bread would be next. After that, there would be nothing. She stared at the pantry door like it might magically produce more supplies if she simply willed it hard enough. Roy noticed her gaze. He stood from the counter and approached her, hands tucked in his pockets. His gait was slow, stiff from sleep and age, but purposeful. He stopped beside her, leaned slightly against the wall, and looked out over the room with a long, measuring glance. "You're running out," he said quietly so the others wouldn't hear. She didn't answer. "You're doing a hell of a thing here," he added. "I don't think most people would have even opened the door." She let out a breath that sounded too much like a sigh. "I didn't open the door because I'm kind, Roy," she said, her voice low. "I opened it because it was either that or admit we were already alone." Roy nodded slowly, not arguing. The bell above the door jingled again, not from someone entering, but from a gust of wind pressing hard against the frame. The latch rattled. Someone would need to fix that again before nightfall. Daniela stepped forward, grabbed the dish towel from her apron, and began wiping the already clean counter with restless hands. In the lull of conversation, a voice spoke up from the far booth. "This place looks exactly the same," said a bearded man with a gravelly drawl. His hair was gray at the temples, and his eyes were sharp, like someone used to scanning miles of road. Daniela looked up. "I stopped here maybe 15 years ago. Hell, could have been 20. That your grandma in the photo up there?" She nodded. "Mabel, my grandmother." "She was a legend," the man said. "Everyone on the route knew her. Saved my ass one time during an ice storm not too far from here. Slid off the road, got stuck in a ditch, called over the CB, and wouldn't you know it, she answered. Didn't even ask who I was. Just told me to hang tight, sent someone in a beat-up Ford pickup to tow me out. Then made me pancakes and gave me a quilt for the night." Another voice chimed in from a table nearby. "Mabel's? You mean the Mabel's Diner? I thought they tore this place down." Daniela smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knew both grief and pride. "It tried to fall down," she said. "I just kept standing it back up." A murmur of laughter passed through the room. Heads turned toward her with a mix of respect and disbelief. These were men who had seen towns vanish in the rearview mirror, places gutted by bypasses and big-box stores. They knew what it meant to keep something alive when the world no longer remembered it. "Mabel saved a lot of us," said Roy, turning back to the group. "She didn't just serve food, she served home." A silence followed that wasn't awkward. It was reverent, the kind of hush that settles in churches and funeral homes. Daniela felt it wrap around her like a blanket she hadn't realized she needed. Then someone clapped their hands once and stood up. "We got a wrench in my rig. If you've got a busted heater or a toilet that's seen better days, I'll take a look." "I can fix that latch on the door," said another. "Got an old guitar in my truck," a third added. "Might be out of tune, but it still sings." And just like that, a new kind of rhythm took over the diner. While Daniela boiled water for weak tea, two of the drivers reattached the sagging door with screws from their toolkits. One of the men rerouted an extension cord to get the old jukebox blinking again, though the only song that would play was an out-of-tune Patsy Cline ballad. No one complained. Roy disappeared for a while and returned with 2 MREs and a jar of peanut butter from his cab. Others contributed what they could: crackers, cans of chili, granola bars half smashed but still edible. It wasn't much, but it felt like plenty. Daniela felt her heart lift and twist at once. Gratitude and shame danced uncomfortably close. These men, many of them strangers, were giving what little they had, and she had so little left to give back. Late that afternoon, as the light dimmed and the wind began to howl again, she slipped out the back door and trudged through the snow to the trailer. Her boots sank deep, and each step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the trailer was dark and cold. The space heater had given up 2 nights ago. She opened the pantry slowly, hoping the cold had at least preserved the contents. 2 cans of baked beans, a sack of potatoes beginning to sprout, a frozen meatloaf wrapped in foil, intended for Sunday dinner with the kids. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she reached out, took everything and loaded it into a box. She paused at the doorway, the box heavy in her arms, the weight of a week's worth of meals disappearing in one cold decision. She looked back at the small couch where Mia had fallen asleep reading the same picture book 4 nights in a row, at the framed photo of herself and her husband on the wall, at the space where he used to sit. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the snow. When she returned to the diner, faces turned. No one spoke, but they saw what she carried. They saw what it cost her. And none of them moved to stop her. She set the box on the counter. Josh was at her side in an instant. "Are you sure?" he asked in a whisper. She met his eyes. "They need it. We'll figure something out." He nodded once and didn't argue. Together they got to work. The meatloaf went into the oven, the potatoes were peeled and boiled, then mashed with margarine and a little salt. The beans simmered slowly, filling the diner with a smell that reminded Daniela of every church potluck and family reunion of her youth. Plates were filled again. Conversations resumed. The laughter returned. The jukebox wheezed its way through another broken country song. No one mentioned the sacrifice, but their eyes said what words couldn't. That night, no one left. They pushed the tables together, spread out blankets, laid down coats to soften the floor. Someone found a deck of cards. Someone else passed around peppermint candies from the bottom of a glove box. It wasn't home, not really, but it was close enough. Daniela, exhausted, sat at the counter and watched them all. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the coffee pot. Roy leaned beside her. "You know," he said, "I think Mabel would be proud." Daniela didn't reply. She didn't trust her voice not to crack. Instead, she poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. As the snow piled higher against the windows, the little diner at the edge of nowhere glowed softly from within, like a lighthouse on a frozen sea. And in that light, surrounded by weary travelers and the last crumbs of her pantry, Daniela Matthews stood a little taller. She had nothing left, and still she gave. Night returned with a vengeance, darker and colder than any that had come before. The diner's thin walls creaked beneath the weight of the wind. Snow fell steadily again, blanketing the already smothered world, and the temperature dropped so sharply that frost began crawling up the inside corners of the windows like a silent intruder. Inside Mabel's, the glow from the overhead lights flickered with an almost nervous rhythm. The generator out back, a grumbling, rust-flecked machine older than Daniela herself, had been chugging for hours, running off the last of the fuel reserve Roy had brought in from his rig. It wasn't meant to run this long. She could hear the change in its pitch, feel the warning in its shudder. Still, she said nothing. She didn't want to frighten the kids. She didn't want to admit she was frightened herself. The men, most of them still awake, had made themselves as comfortable as possible. Booth cushions were pulled onto the floor, blankets and jackets laid across them. Someone had taped cardboard over the bottom of the door to stop the draft, and another had stacked crates and cans against the weakest wall to brace against the wind. It wasn't much, but it helped. Dinner, if it could be called that, had been met with reverence. Not a morsel had been wasted. The meatloaf had been sliced so thin that it bordered on spiritual restraint. The mashed potatoes stretched miraculously to feed every belly. The beans were scraped from the pot as though they were gold. And through it all, no one complained. No one asked for seconds. The silence at the tables spoke not of lack, but of gratitude, the kind that couldn't be bought or faked. Josh had fallen asleep curled up beside Mia beneath a thick blanket near the heater. He had insisted on giving up the cot that Roy had offered him, choosing instead to stay with his sister. Daniela had kissed them both good night, tucking a scarf around Mia's head to keep the cold from nipping her ears. Her babies, her entire world, bundled together on a floor in a room full of strangers, and yet she felt safer here tonight than she had in years. She moved behind the counter, turning off the coffee pot and checking the remaining tea bags. Only 3 left. The water supply in the kitchen had slowed to a trickle, the pipes flirting with freezing. She wrapped another towel around the base of the faucet and prayed silently that it would hold through the night. Roy was sitting at the window, the same window her grandmother used to sit near with her newspaper and glasses slipping down her nose. He didn't say anything when Daniela sat beside him. He just looked out into the storm, his jaw tight. "How's the generator?" she asked softly. He shrugged. "Still going, barely. It's got 1 more night in it, maybe." Daniela leaned her head back against the cool wall, closing her eyes. "I don't have anything else left," she said, not meaning to say it out loud. It just spilled out like water over a cracked rim. Roy didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Maybe not in the fridge, but you've got enough inside you to feed an army." She laughed bitterly. "Hope doesn't keep pipes from freezing." "No," he agreed, "but it keeps people from giving up when they do." They sat in silence, watching the snow build on the glass. The wind pressed harder now, shaking the door in its frame. The tape holding the cardboard flapped. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot rattled against the stovetop, shifting as if to remind them it was still there. Then, without warning, everything went dark. The lights blinked once and died. The heater gave a slow whine and fell silent. The hum of the fridge stopped. The jukebox sputtered and then cut out entirely. The low glow from the corner lamp vanished as though it had never been. For a moment, no one moved. The cold swept in like a thief. Daniela's breath caught in her throat. She felt it, the stillness of a room when the warmth dies. "Mama?" came Josh's voice, sleepy and uncertain. "It's okay, baby," she said quickly, rising to her feet. "Just the generator." Murmurs spread through the room as men sat up, rubbing their arms and pulling blankets tighter. Some moved toward the window. Others stood, checking on one another in the dim light. The only illumination now came from the red exit sign above the door and the silver-gray hue of the snow reflecting moonlight through the glass. Roy was already on his feet. "I'll check it," he said, grabbing his jacket and gloves. Daniela nodded and followed him to the back door. He stepped out into the night, and she pulled it shut behind him, leaning against the frame for a moment. The cold pressed in, cruel and swift, biting at her fingers even through her sweater. Her eyes stung. She turned and scanned the room. The men were quiet again, pulling together, whispering, helping each other. One man offered his last pair of thick socks to another whose feet had turned pale. Someone else rolled out an old sleeping bag and opened it wide enough to fit 2. Mia stirred and coughed once before settling again. Daniela moved through the diner with her arms wrapped tight around her torso, whispering reassurances she barely believed. In the kitchen, the silence was more oppressive. She lit a single emergency candle and placed it on the stove, watching the flame flutter like it, too, was deciding whether to stay. Her pantry was empty now, truly empty. Not a can, not a crumb, only the cracked tiles and the quiet echo of work long done. 10 minutes passed, 15. Then the door at the back opened with a gust, and Roy stepped inside, his face red with cold and his hands shaking slightly. "Patched it best I could," he said. "She'll run for a little while longer, but we're on borrowed time." Daniela nodded. "Thank you." He looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Not romance, not pity, just recognition, a mutual understanding of what it meant to hold too much for too long. As the generator coughed back to life, the lights flickered on again. Weak, like a dying flashlight, but there. The heater groaned and began to blow its thin stream of lukewarm air. The jukebox let out a garbled squawk but remained still. Cheers rose, soft and tired but genuine. Men clapped Roy on the back. One muttered, "You're a damn wizard," and handed him a hot mug of water as a toast. Daniela returned to the counter and stood there, unsure of what to do next. And that was when she felt it, deep in her bones. The unraveling. Not the kind that comes with a single dramatic crack, but the slow, thread-by-thread unspooling of a person who has given everything and found nothing left. She stepped into the kitchen, closed the swinging door behind her, and leaned against the wall. Her legs threatened to give way. Her arms trembled. Her face, so carefully controlled all night, crumpled. Silent tears slid down her cheeks, and she let them. She didn't sob. There was no noise, just release. A few minutes later, she felt a presence and opened her eyes to see Josh standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just walked to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You're doing good, Mama," he said into her stomach. She hugged him tightly, too tightly. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I know," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I drew something, earlier when we were waiting for dinner." She opened it. A crayon drawing, shaky and childlike. A picture of the diner, snow falling outside. Inside, little stick figures, her, Josh, Mia, the truckers, all with big smiles. Above the building, in bright orange letters, he had written, "Home." She stared at it for a long time. Then she stood up, wiped her face, and nodded. "I need you to watch your sister," she said gently. "Where are you going?" "Just to get some more food." He didn't ask where, he just nodded. Back in the trailer, Daniela moved quickly despite the cold. She grabbed a small basket from the cupboard and filled it with anything she could find. 2 apples from the kids' school lunches, a bag of rice, a packet of hot cocoa. She took a box of bacon mix meant for Mia's birthday pancakes and a bag of frozen peas. Finally, she grabbed the last tin of cinnamon rolls from the freezer, the ones she'd saved for Christmas morning. She returned to the diner without ceremony, placed the basket on the counter, and got to work. No one questioned it. But the mood changed. A quiet reverence settled over the room, different from before. They saw her. Really saw her. Not just the woman who poured their coffee and made their soup, but the woman who, with nothing in her hands, still found a way to give. That night, the diner didn't just shelter the storm. It beat it back, one warm bowl at a time. The first light of morning broke slowly across the snow-covered landscape, a pale shimmer that seemed less like sunrise and more like the sky cautiously peeking in to see if the world had survived the night. It was not warm, nor particularly promising, but it was there. Soft and colorless, washing over the frost-bitten ground and glinting off the icicles that now hung like teeth from the edge of Mabel's roof. The worst of the storm had passed, though it left the town and the diner wrapped in a thick, suffocating stillness. Inside, the hush remained. The heater had long since given up again, and the generator sputtered once or twice before falling into silence for the final time. No one moved to fix it. There was nothing left to fix it with. The warmth had receded into blankets and shared body heat, and it clung there stubbornly, refusing to vanish completely. Daniela stood near the front door with a broom in her hand, sweeping away a thin film of snow that had managed to creep in beneath the jam overnight. The motion was slow, more meditative than practical. Her joints ached with a dull persistence that reminded her she hadn't sat down for more than a few minutes since the storm began. Her palms were raw, her ankles swollen, her thoughts quieter than they'd been in days. The night had been long. The men had curled up where they could, some in booths, others on the floor beside the stove, which now stood as a dark, cold husk. One driver had draped his coat over Mia, whose tiny form barely moved beneath the layers of fabric. Josh lay next to her, one arm stretched protectively across his sister, the other tucked under his cheek. They hadn't stirred in hours, not even when the generator finally died. It had taken everything Daniela had left to keep things moving through the night. After that final meal, the last scrapings of rice and thawed vegetables, she'd brewed what remained of the hot cocoa and passed it around in chipped mugs. No one had spoken while they drank. It had been a kind of communion, a silent understanding that whatever happened next, this moment had been enough to carry them through the coldest hour. Now, morning. A muted pink touched the tips of the trees in the distance. The road beyond the diner was still hidden beneath a curtain of snow, though the wind had calmed, and the air had taken on that particular sharpness that only comes after a blizzard has done its damage and retreated. In the parking lot, the trucks sat in orderly rows like sleeping beasts, their chrome dulled by ice, their windshields white and blind. Daniela looked out through the window, her hand resting on the sill. Her breath fogged the glass. She watched it disappear and return, over and over, as if she had to keep proving she was still there, still alive. The hum of life was gone now. No engines, no voices, not even the clatter of dishes. The diner was too quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace, but rather like something had been emptied out. Roy was the first to wake. He stretched stiffly in the booth he'd claimed near the window, groaned as he sat upright and rubbed his back like a man twice his age. His eyes met Daniela's, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other without speaking. Then he nodded once, a gesture that carried with it something final. She returned the nod, though she didn't quite know why. It felt like the end of something, of what, she wasn't sure. A chapter, maybe, or a dream. One by one, the others began to stir. There were no loud voices, no groans or complaints, just the shuffle of boots, the quiet packing of bags, the whisper of sleeping bags being rolled. Some stretched their limbs, others hunched over to warm their fingers by rubbing them together. A few stood near the windows and peered out, trying to gauge the state of the world beyond. "Looks like they cleared the main road," someone said, pointing toward the direction of the interstate. "Plows must have come through early." "Can't say I'll miss this cold," another murmured. There was a pause. Then Roy stood. "Well, I guess this is it." He looked around the room, his voice low but clear. "We made it." A few men nodded. One clapped another on the back. There were no goodbyes, not really, just small gestures, tight smiles, a squeeze on the shoulder, a shared glance. That was the way of the road. Connection built not on words, but on proximity, on time spent in the trenches of weather and worry. Daniela stood behind the counter as they gathered their things. She said nothing as they passed, just offered each one a look of gratitude, and they, in return, left behind more than footprints. They left behind a memory, a warmth she could still feel even as the cold crept back in. Josh and Mia were the last to wake. Daniela helped them sit up, wrapping them in their coats, brushing hair from their faces. "Is it morning?" Mia asked sleepily. "It is," Daniela said softly. "The storm's over." Mia blinked, then smiled. "We made it." Josh didn't say anything. He just looked around the diner, then up at his mother. His eyes were too serious for his age. He had seen too much these past few days, learned too much too fast. Outside, the first of the trucks started up, the deep rumble of engines returning to life. It was a strange sound, comforting in a way, like the heartbeat of the road had resumed. Daniela moved to the door and opened it slowly. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't flinch. She stepped out onto the porch and watched as the trucks rolled one by one out of the lot and back onto the road. They honked in short bursts as they passed, and she raised a hand in farewell. Then the last one was gone. She turned and looked back into the diner. Empty now, the booths bare, the floor marked with the imprint of sleeping bags and heavy boots. The air still held the ghost of warmth, but it was fading fast. The silence returned, heavier this time. Daniela walked back inside, shut the door, and locked it. She moved behind the counter and turned off the switch to the lights that no longer worked. Then she stood for a long time, staring at the wall across from her. The photo of Mabel still hung there, tilted slightly to the left. Daniela reached out and straightened it with a trembling hand. She looked around the diner, the chipped tiles, the worn counter, the faded menus that no one read anymore. She thought of all the nights spent here, all the mornings that began with the smell of coffee and hope. And now, this, the quiet aftermath of something too big to name. She moved to the back and gathered the trash, bagged the empty cans, swept the crumbs. She folded the blankets and set them neatly in the supply closet. She wiped the tables until her hands ached, then did it again. There was nothing left to do, but still she kept going, unable to sit still. Josh came to her side. "Is it over?" he asked. She looked down at him, then at the front window where the snow had begun to melt in thin rivulets down the glass. "I don't know," she answered honestly. He looked thoughtful for a moment. "We still have the sign." She followed his gaze out the window. The old "For Sale" sign leaned awkwardly against the fence out back, snow piled around its base. She'd meant to remove it weeks ago, but hadn't found the time or the energy. Now it stood like a silent reminder of a decision she hadn't quite made. "Maybe it's time," she murmured. He didn't argue. She walked to the back door, opened it, and stepped into the blinding white. The sun had risen just enough to glint off the snow, casting a painful brightness across the world. She trudged to the sign, grabbed it with numb fingers, and yanked it free. She stood there a long time, holding it, unsure what to do next. Behind her, the diner waited, not broken, not whole, but still standing. The snow had barely begun to soften in the midday sun when the sound came, a low murmur at first, indistinct and distant, the kind of vibration that rumbled beneath the feet before it registered in the ears. Daniela had been sweeping out the foyer again, not because it needed it, but because the movement helped silence the thoughts looping in her head. She paused mid-stroke, head tilted, broom braced across her hip. Her ears, so attuned now to the absence of life, caught the faint throb of diesel engines on the wind. At first, she thought it might be wishful thinking, maybe a snowplow passing on the far highway, or the echo of a truck long gone. But then it grew louder, unmistakable in its rhythm. Not one, but many. The crunch of tires over packed snow, the sigh of air brakes, the cough of idling motors. She dropped the broom. From behind the counter, Josh sprang to his feet, already sensing that something had changed. Mia, still sleepy from her nap in the supply closet, blinked and sat up, rubbing her eyes. Daniela moved to the front door, her heart knocking hard against her ribs. She pulled it open just as the first truck turned off the main road and rolled into the lot. It was massive, gleaming despite the crusted ice along its bumper. Its cab painted a deep navy blue with silver streaks across the side. It was followed by another, then another. A convoy. A stream of rigs, each engine humming like a note in a chorus. Within minutes, the lot that had been desolate and silent just hours earlier swelled with machines, parked nose to nose in tight, careful rows. It looked like a parade returning from battle. Daniela stood motionless, wind cutting across her cheeks, snow swirling around her boots. She couldn't count them all, but there had to be at least 24 rigs out there, maybe more, their windshields glinting in the sun like watchful eyes. Then the diner door swung wide with a cheerful jingle, and in walked Roy. He looked almost exactly as he had 2 days ago, only his cheeks were less hollow, and there was something else in his face now. Brightness, mischief, life. His heavy coat was flecked with snow, and in his gloved hand he carried a large thermos. A crooked grin stretched across his face. "Hope you got that coffee on," he said. Daniela gaped at him. "Roy, what?" Before she could finish, the others began piling in. Men and women, some young, some old, all in thick jackets, boots caked in snow, cheeks red from the cold. Some she recognized from the storm, others were strangers. They filled the diner like floodwater, smiling, stomping their feet, shaking hands, greeting one another like a family reunited. Roy stepped forward and gently placed an envelope on the counter. Daniela stared at it. "We passed the hat around," he said, his voice lower now. "Dispatchers, drivers, some old friends from the CB days. A few companies kicked in, too. Even a couple of folks who just read the story and wanted to help." Daniela reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked up the envelope. It was thick, far too heavy to be a simple gesture. She opened it slowly and pulled out a stack of bills, neatly bundled and rubber-banded. Beneath that, checks, receipts, notes written in Sharpie and pen and pencil, for the woman who kept the fire burning, for Mabel's granddaughter, for home on the road. "It's enough," Roy added, "enough to clear the bank. Keep the lights on. Start fresh if you want to." Daniela couldn't speak. Her throat was thick with tears she wasn't ready to let fall. She looked at Josh, whose eyes were wide, mouth parted. She looked at Mia, who was clutching the edge of her shirt. Another driver stepped forward then. He was older, gray-bearded, with a lined face and eyes that sparkled with memory. In his hand, he carried an object wrapped in a red shop rag. He set it on the counter with care and slowly unwrapped it to reveal a well-worn CB microphone. Black plastic, scuffed and faded, with a fraying cord and a strip of silver duct tape holding it together. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Roy turned to Daniela, nodding once toward the mic. "That was your grandfather's, Jack Matthews, C.B. King." Daniela's breath caught. "I kept it after mine burned out in a storm. Your grandma gave it to me, said if it kept Jack safe, it'll keep you safe too. Been in my rig ever since." Figured it was time it came home. She reached out, fingertips brushing the worn plastic. Her vision blurred. For a moment, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice on the radio, calm and steady, guiding someone through the night. Roy chuckled. Word's out now. Every driver from here to the Rockies knows about Mabel's, and we're not letting it go. Laughter erupted across the diner, a rich, rolling sound full of warmth and disbelief and sheer joy. Josh let out a whoop and grabbed his sister's hand, pulling her into a spin in the middle of the floor. Mia squealed with delight. The noise swelled, boots stomping, mugs clinking, the bell over the door jingling again and again as more drivers arrived. The sound of life, sudden and overwhelming, filled the space like fire poured into a cold hearth. Ethan, the teenage line cook from down the road who had helped out occasionally, stumbled in through the kitchen door, blinking at the full house. His apron still hung from a hook behind him. He gawked at the crowd. "What happened?" "Community happened," Roy said with a wink. Drivers brought in supplies. Coffee grounds, canned goods, industrial-sized rolls of paper towels. Someone had a crate of eggs. Another rolled in a tank of propane. Daniela looked around, hands still shaking. She moved behind the counter on autopilot, opening cabinets, clearing space, flipping switches. The coffee machine hissed back to life. The griddle warmed under her palms. She brewed the first pot herself, watching as the dark liquid poured into the pot. Then she poured a cup, set it down on the counter, and turned to the crowd. "First cup's on the house," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "And so's a story, if you're staying long enough to hear one." The laughter returned. Roy raised his cup in salute. "Welcome home." Outside, the sun climbed higher. The for sale sign lay half buried in the snowdrift near the fence, forgotten. Inside, the windows fogged with the breath of people who had chosen to stop and stay and warm each other with presence and memory. The jukebox, long dead, let out a sudden crackle. Then, miraculously, music spilled out, an old gospel tune, warbling through bad speakers, but loud enough to turn heads. One of the drivers whooped and grabbed a mop handle like a microphone. Ethan fired up the grill. Josh rolled up his sleeves. Mia danced between tables, collecting napkins that had fluttered to the floor. Daniela stood in the middle of it all, the envelope still clutched in her hands, the microphone nestled gently beside the register, and a crowd of people ready to rebuild. She wasn't alone anymore. She would never be alone in this place again. They had come for warmth and food and coffee, but they had brought something far greater. They had brought her back to life. 1 year later, the snow returned, but this time it came softly. Not as a threat, not as a siege, but as a quiet guest descending upon the hills of Oklahoma. It blanketed the roadside in a white hush and made the world outside the glowing windows of Mabel's look like a postcard, calm, steady, serene. Inside, the diner hummed with a warmth that no storm could touch. The air smelled of cinnamon rolls and bacon grease, of fresh coffee and, something sweeter still, belonging. The lot was full again, not with drifting rigs fleeing from ice and wind, but with trucks parked side by side like old friends, their chrome winking under the sun. They came from everywhere. Wyoming, Texas, Illinois, Nebraska, each cab marked with its own dust and road wear, each driver bearing stories stitched together by thousands of miles. Some had names that were known now, not from fame, but from community. Some were new, told to stop here by someone who once found a miracle on a snow-blind night. Inside the diner, the booths were full. Laughter bounced off the worn wood walls, and plates clattered against the counters. A few old-timers lounged by the windows, boots up, sipping coffee like it was sacred. A young couple from Ohio sat near the jukebox, tapping their feet to a country tune. Children played near the back, chasing one another around bar stools. On the far wall, where once there was only faded wallpaper, a framed photograph now hung in a place of honor. It was a black and white picture. Mabel, arms around two drivers, a coffee pot in one hand, her other hand raised mid-story. Her smile was wide, eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. The photo had been blown up and framed in walnut, with a brass plate beneath that read, "Mabel Matthews, Mother of the Road." Just beneath it was a second photo, this one in full color. Daniela, flanked by Josh and Mia, all three smiling, arms around one another, standing outside the newly painted diner in spring sunlight, beneath the freshly hung sign that simply read, "Mabel's. Home for the road." It had taken work. So much work. After the convoy left that day, Daniela didn't rest, not even for a moment. She filed every document, paid every overdue notice, registered every permit. The roof had to be redone, the freezer replaced. She rewired the back wall herself with a manual in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She learned to fix a fryer, pour concrete, calibrate a food scale, and reorder bulk coffee. She learned how to hire people, then learned how to trust them. She discovered she was capable of more than she had ever believed, and that the road was full of people who would not let her fall. Word spread fast, faster than she could have imagined. One article led to another. A video clip of Josh serving pancakes to a line of drivers hit 1 million views in a week. People sent letters, then postcards, then their stories. Drivers left photographs in the mail. Some drove out of their way just to leave a note on the corkboard near the door. One woman, who had never even passed through Oklahoma, sent a handmade quilt with the words embroidered along the bottom. Kindness travels farther than wheels ever could. Daniela kept it folded on the back of the corner booth. Now, 1 year later, she stood behind the counter wearing a new apron with the same stitched name across the front. Her hands were stronger, her face a little more lined, her eyes just as deep. She poured coffee with a practiced rhythm, greeting every regular by name, every stranger with warmth. She knew how to take orders with one hand while balancing a baby on her hip if needed. She could flip a pancake, write a receipt, and make a little girl feel safe, all without missing a beat. Josh was taller now, leaner, with the first hint of a teenager's voice. He worked weekends and after school, manning the register, slicing pies, restocking the soda fridge. Mia had become a darling of the diner, forever darting between tables, handing out crayons and hugs. The drivers spoiled her rotten. She never asked for anything. She just smiled and reminded everyone, without trying, why they came. The place itself had changed too. The old jukebox had been rebuilt by a driver from Kansas who specialized in vintage machines. It now played a mix of blues, country, and gospel, filling the space with music that sounded like memory. The booths had been reupholstered in bright red vinyl. The counter was refinished, the floor retiled, the kitchen expanded. Yet nothing essential had changed. The soul of the place was intact, because Daniela had refused to let it become anything other than what it always was. A refuge, a pause, a beginning. That morning, as she leaned against the counter wiping her hands on a towel, she looked up at the door and smiled. Roy walked in carrying a newspaper and a bag of oranges. His hair was thinner, beard grayer, but he still walked like the road was his dance partner. "You're late," Daniela teased. "Traffic," he said, placing the oranges on the counter. Can't blame me if everyone in the country decided to stop here for coffee." "You love it," she replied. He didn't deny it. He took his usual spot near the window and unfolded his paper. The rustle of pages joined the ambient noise of the diner. A few minutes later, a young man entered, a driver no older than 20, nervous, clearly new to the game. He held the door too long, snow sweeping in behind him. Daniela waved him inside before the chill could settle. "First time here?" she asked. He nodded. "Heard about this place from a guy in Utah. Said I had to stop. Something about it being legendary." She chuckled. "Well, the coffee's hot. First cup's on the house. And if you've got time, I've got stories." The boy smiled, his shoulders relaxing. He found a seat at the counter and tucked his gloves into his coat sleeve. Outside, snowflakes began to drift again, dancing in the sunlight. Inside, the diner buzzed with life. Somewhere in the back, someone dropped a tray. Laughter followed. Mia sang to herself while stacking crayons into rainbows. Josh leaned against the fridge, recounting a joke he'd heard on the CB to a table full of drivers who roared in approval. Roy turned a page in his newspaper and smiled quietly to himself. Daniela took a moment, just one, to close her eyes. She could almost feel it then, not memory, not sorrow, but presence. Jack, her grandfather, steady hands on the wheel. Mabel, her voice rising above the clatter of cutlery. Not ghosts, not specters, but something in the air itself, stitched into the beams, the floor, the very light pouring through the windows. This place was made of them, and now of her. She opened her eyes and moved back to the counter where another driver had taken a seat, a new story ready to begin. Outside, the trucks came and went. Inside, the road continued, not as a line of pavement, but as a living, breathing thing, a connection, a promise. And in the golden hum of that promise, Mabel's lived on. Always here, always home. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next one and share this video with someone who needs to see it.